Before we jump into this crazy story, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Maybe a sleepy street in Vermont, a bustling downtown in Chicago, or a cozy mountain cabin in Colorado. I love seeing just how far these wild Karen tales of chaos and karma can reach. The first time I saw the rooftops rising on my own land, I thought I was hallucinating. The summer sun in central Texas can cook a man's brain if he isn't careful. But even heat stroke couldn't explain 27 foundations poured in neat rows across the pasture I'd inherited from my father. My boots kicked up dust as I walked the ridge line, eyes locked on the cluster of houses being hammered together by workers who didn't seem to care whose name was on the deed. The air carried the sharp scent of cut lumber and wet cement. I could hear nail guns popping like fireworks, men shouting over the roar of generators. And there, standing proud in the middle of it all, were two women I had prayed I'd never see on my property, Kathy and Eva. The Karen sisters, that's what half the county called them when they weren't around. Kathy, with her shoulder-length blonde hair and her permanent scowl, strutted around in a red t-shirt that clung too tightly in the heat. She barked orders at the workers like she owned an army. Eva, in a floral summer dress, waved her arms in broad theatrical gestures, pointing at spots where she wanted fences or driveways. Together, they looked like self-appointed queens of a kingdom built out of other people's patience. And somehow, impossibly, their kingdom was sitting on my land. I marched straight down the slope, heart pounding harder with each step. My father had grazed cattle here, and I'd grown up fixing fences under these mesquite trees. Every inch of soil held memory. Yet now bulldozers had chewed it up, leveling ridges, filling gullies, carving roads where there should have been nothing but prairie grass and stubborn rocks. "Excuse me," I shouted, my voice cracking from a mix of rage and disbelief. Kathy barely turned her head. She raised a clipboard and scribbled something like I was a nuisance, not the owner. Eva spotted me first, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, if it isn't the cowboy," she said loudly, so the whole crew could hear. "Come to see progress? Doesn't it look fabulous?" "This is my land," I said, voice low but steady. "You don't have any right to be here." Kathy finally looked at me then, squinting like she was sizing up a fly she meant to swat. She took a few steps forward, boots crunching on gravel, and held out the clipboard like it was a shield. "Wrong neighbor," she said. "We've got full approval from the Homeowners Association and preliminary permits. You'll thank us when this place triples in value." I grabbed the papers and skimmed them. They weren't permits. They were copies, badly forged, county letterheads printed in gray instead of black, signatures that looked like a child had scribbled them. My stomach turned. "These are fake," I said. "You think you can bully your way into stealing land by waving forged documents?" Eva fluttered her hands, as if the heat itself excused their lies. "Oh, please. Everyone wants housing. You should be grateful we're turning your empty field into a community. Families will live here. Kids will play in backyards instead of weeds. Don't you want progress?" Progress. That word landed like a nail through my boot. My family had fought to keep this land free of developers for generations. And now, two sisters with arrogance, louder than thunder, were painting theft as progress. I stormed into town that afternoon, dust still clinging to my jeans. At the county office, I shoved the forged papers onto a clerk's desk. The man sighed like I was the 10th fool to waste his day. He promised to look into it, then handed the stack back as though I had handed him grocery receipts. The sheriff gave me the same shrug. "Civil matter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Take it up with a lawyer. Until a judge says otherwise, I can't stop them." So I did. I paid a lawyer who wore suits sharp enough to cut glass. He listened, nodded, then told me the case would take months, maybe years, before anything changed. By then, those houses would be sold, the land tied up in a nightmare of litigation. I drove back, fists gripping the steering wheel, so hard my knuckles turned white. And as I rolled past the half-built subdivision, I saw the sisters throwing a barbecue on my land. Smoke rose from a grill, children ran across what used to be my father's pasture, and Kathy raised a red plastic cup like a toast when she spotted me. "Don't worry, cowboy," she hollered across the lot. You can still mow the grass around the clubhouse. We'll pay you in hot dogs." Laughter erupted around her like she was queen of comedy. Every nerve in my body wanted to march over and knock the smug grin off her face. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched as week after week, roofs went up, siding nailed down, driveways paved. 27 houses, identical boxes lined like soldiers, eating away at the soul of the land I had vowed to protect. Residents began moving in, hauling couches, planting flowers, waving at each other like it was just another nice neighborhood. They didn't know their homes were stolen goods. But the sisters knew, and they enjoyed every second. Kathy loved to corner me when I passed by. "We're calling this Riverbend States," she'd announce, flipping her blonde hair back. "Isn't that charming?" Eva would clap her hands and add, "We're putting in a playground too." Imagine children laughing right where you used to. What, herd cows? Times are changing. Times might have been changing, but the land never forgets. I knew those houses stood on a floodplain. My father had shown me once, years back, where the water carved scars into the soil after a storm. It looked harmless most of the time, just a dry creek bed winding through mesquite and stone. But in the right conditions, it became a river with no mercy. I warned them. God knows I tried. One afternoon, when the sky was blazing hot and cicadas shrieked in the trees, I walked right into their little HOA meeting. Residents sat on folding chairs while Eva performed a speech about neighborhood spirit. "This land floods," I told them, cutting through the chatter. "You've built on a river's back. When the storms come, no drainage system will save you." Gasps, whispers. Kathy jumped to her feet, pointing at me like I was the intruder. "This man is bitter because he sold us the land cheap. Don't listen to his ghost stories." "I never sold you anything," I said, voice steady. "You stole it." Security, their hired cousin overweight in a neon vest, escorted me out while the sisters smirked like cats with cream. I drove home that evening under a blood-red sunset, my truck rattling along the dirt road. Anger boiled inside me, but beneath it a colder thought began to take shape. If the county wouldn't stop them, and the law moved too slowly, maybe nature itself would. Storm season wasn't far off. The rivers would rise. The sisters had built their empire on sand. Weeks passed, and dark clouds started rolling over the hills more often. Nights carried the smell of rain, heavy and electric. My neighbors grumbled about forecasts, but I listened more closely than most. Every drop of water that fell on the hills above would race down toward the valley where those 27 houses stood. One afternoon, I caught Kathy at the edge of the new development, barking orders at a crew digging trenches for drainage. I walked up, mud sucking at my boots. "You think those ditches will stop it?" I asked. "When the river comes, it won't trickle. It'll roar. You're gambling with people's lives." She sneered, crossing her arms. "We raised HOA fees to cover drainage. That's how responsible communities work. Maybe you should try joining civilization instead of clinging to dirt and cows." Eva appeared then, waving her arms in mock despair. "Oh, Noah, build us an ark. Quick, before we drown." Laughter spilled from her throat, sharp and ugly. I stared at them both, the sound of thunder faint in the distance. My jaw clenched so hard it ached, but I didn't shout. I just looked at those neat rows of houses, the fake street signs they'd planted, the fragile pride they carried like armor. And in my gut, I felt it. Their downfall wasn't a matter of if. It was only when. That night the rain began. Slow at first, a soft patter on the tin roof of my porch, then steady, drumming like 1,000 fists. The smell of wet cedar filled the air. I sat awake, listening, every nerve alive with the storm song. By morning, water already licked the edges of their streets. Cars splashed through, residents frowning at puddles that shouldn't have been there. Kathy stomped around in rubber boots, yelling for sandbags. Eva flapped her arms, directing neighbors like she was saving the Titanic. And from my ridgeline, I watched it all. Calm, patient, waiting. The storm wasn't finished. The river hadn't even woken yet. The real flood was still coming. And when it did, nothing those sisters built would stand. The county clerk's office smelled of dust and coffee when I walked in the following week, carrying every scrap of paperwork that proved the land was mine. The woman behind the glass partition looked at the title deed, nodded once, and gave me a sympathetic half-smile. "You're not the first, you know," she said quietly. "Those sisters, they've been stirring trouble with other properties too. Always some loophole, always some claim." She lowered her voice as if afraid they might overhear from miles away. "But your deed's clean. This land is yours without question." Hearing that gave me fuel. For days I had felt like I was losing my grip, like reality itself was slipping from under me. But that piece of paper was solid proof. I walked out gripping it so tight my knuckles went white. I thought maybe this was the crack in their armor, the opening I needed. But Kathy and Eva weren't about to fold. The next morning, I drove by the property and saw the impossible. Not just the frames of new houses anymore. Whole walls were painted, roofs were up, and concrete trucks rumbled through the dirt road like an invading army. Workers shouted, hammers clanged, and the twins strutted around like generals on a battlefield. Eva barked orders at a contractor, her floral dress blowing in the hot wind, while Kathy stood near a brand-new white SUV, clipboard in hand, pointing at blueprints, as if she were some kind of architect. When she saw me, Kathy's mouth curled into that smug grin. She waved like we were neighbors sharing a morning greeting, then leaned toward Eva. They both laughed, loud and sharp, as if I were nothing more than entertainment. I parked my truck, stormed over, and shouted above the chaos. "This is my land. You've seen the deed. You can't just steal it." Eva turned slowly, her arms crossed high on her chest, eyes narrowing. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with mock pity. "This isn't stealing. It's called development. You should be thanking us. We're raising property values in this backwater." Kathy stepped closer, the heat of the midday sun shining off her forehead. "Besides, what are you going to do? Sue us? Huh. We've got lawyers lined up. HOA lawyers, county lawyers. You'd drown in paperwork before you ever got close to winning." That word, drown, stuck in my head like a splinter. I wanted to deck her right there, but I didn't. I turned, climbed back into my truck, and drove away with their laughter following me down the dusty road. But inside, something shifted. They were too arrogant, too sure of themselves. And arrogance, I knew, was the perfect weakness to exploit. I spent nights researching, days driving around Central Texas, talking to neighbors, county inspectors, even a retired hydrologist I found sipping beer at a roadside diner. Everyone had the same story. The sisters cut corners, built fast, ignored warnings. And the biggest warning of all? The floodplain. That patch of land had seen water rise before. In July, after heavy storms, the river swelled and spilled across the low fields. Most years it was nothing more than a nuisance, but every once in a while, the floods came strong enough to rip fences from the ground and send cattle floating downstream. Everyone knew it. Everyone respected it, except them. By late June, their construction site looked like a mini suburb. 27 houses stood in neat rows, some already furnished. Trucks came and went delivering shiny appliances, granite countertops, and pallet after pallet of drywall. They had moved fast, almost too fast, as if they knew they had to finish before anyone stopped them. But the skies in Texas don't forgive. The July rains were coming. One evening, I drove to the dam just upriver. It was small, old, more of a flood control structure than anything grand. The creak of the metal gates echoed against the water as I walked along the edge, the smell of damp earth rising around me. I leaned on the rail and stared at the swollen reservoir. If the sisters thought they could outbuild Mother Nature, they were about to learn otherwise. But I didn't want destruction for its own sake. I wanted justice. So I waited. I documented everything. Their illegal building, their harassment, their taunts. I filmed Eva screaming at a delivery driver. I caught Kathy threatening a worker who dared to ask for overtime pay. I gathered testimonies from neighbors. I uploaded clips to social media, each one gaining traction, fueling outrage. People across the county began to whisper about them, their empire of arrogance built on someone else's land. The comments poured in. Classic Karens. Hope karma gets them. Flood them out. That phrase again, flood them out. Still, they pressed forward. On the first day of July, Kathy held what she called a grand preview. Balloons tied to mailboxes, banners fluttering, music blasting from rented speakers. Potential buyers toured the half-finished homes, sipping cold lemonade as the sisters beamed and bragged about their exclusive development. I stood on the edge of the crowd, arms crossed. A couple of people recognized me from the viral clips and whispered. One even muttered, "Isn't that the guy they stole from?" The sisters spotted me, of course, and made a show of waving cheerfully as if nothing was wrong. But I could see it in their eyes, a flicker of unease. The tide of opinion was turning, and they knew it. The storm rolled in a week later. The sky turned the color of ash. Thunder cracked across the plains, shaking windows, rattling nerves. Rain fell in sheets, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The river swelled, brown and angry, rushing toward the low-lying land where their houses stood proud just days earlier. I drove out in the middle of it, wipers slapping furiously, water spraying up over the hood of my truck. I parked on a hill overlooking the development, headlights cutting through the downpour. What I saw made my chest tighten. Water already lapped at the driveways. Fences bobbed like matchsticks, cars sat half-submerged, alarms wailing uselessly into the storm. And there in the chaos were Kathy and Eva, screaming orders at a crew of panicked workers. Eva's floral dress clung to her skin, plastered by the rain. Kathy's red shirt was soaked, her hair sticking flat against her face as she pointed frantically at the rising water. I stepped out of the truck, the rain drenching me instantly, and shouted down the hill. "I told you, this land floods. You didn't listen." Kathy whipped around, face twisted with fury. Even from that distance, I could hear her scream. "This is your fault. You cursed us." Eva's voice joined hers, shrill and desperate. "You'll pay for this." But their words were drowned by the roar of the river as it surged higher, battering walls, tearing siding from frames, swallowing everything they'd built. I stood there, soaked, heart pounding. This was nature's justice, pure and unstoppable. But it wasn't finished yet. The dam loomed in my mind, the final card I hadn't played. The rains had filled it to the brim. One release, one calculated decision, and the flood would sweep their entire empire away. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. I turned, climbed back into my truck, and headed toward the dam. The road was slick, the tires skidding dangerously on the sharp turns, but I pressed on. The rain beat down harder, the wipers barely keeping up. My hands gripped the wheel, my chest tight with a mix of fear and grim resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. If those half-built houses collapsed into the river, they could block the flow and push the floodwaters toward the rest of the town. The sisters hadn't just stolen from me. They had endangered everyone. When I reached the dam, the roar of the water was deafening. The reservoir thrashed against the gates, desperate to break free. I climbed the slick steps, my boots slipping, rain stinging my face. My hands found the cold metal of the wheel that controlled the release. I hesitated, water streaming down my arms. Once I did this, there was no turning back. Behind me, somewhere down the valley, Kathy and Eva screamed against the storm, clinging to their crumbling empire. Ahead of me, the dam groaned, straining under the weight of the storm-swollen reservoir. The choice was clear. I gritted my teeth, tightened my grip, and began to turn the wheel. The gates shuddered, metal grinding against metal, then slowly began to give. A low rumble rose as the flood surged forward, spilling into the river with unstoppable force. I felt it in my bones, in the ground beneath my feet. The valley below would never be the same, and neither would they. The storm came faster than anyone in central Texas could have predicted. The July heat had baked the land for weeks, the soil cracked and dry, the air thick and heavy with a tension that promised something violent was on its way. When the first rumbles of thunder split the night sky, I already knew what was coming. I had been watching the dam for days, monitoring the swollen streams that fed into it, waiting for nature to deliver the final blow I couldn't manage alone. Kathy and Eva had laughed at me just that morning, standing smugly outside one of their half-finished homes, sipping iced tea like queens surveying their stolen empire. They were dressed in their usual summer arrogance. Kathy in a red shirt stretched tight over a frame, denim shorts clinging uncomfortably, while Eva wore a cheap floral dress that did little to hide her broad shoulders and restless anger. They jeered at me as I drove past, shouting that maybe I should take pictures before their neighborhood was finished, because soon I'd have no land to claim. Their voices carried, shrill and sharp, even above the sound of construction. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The dam was ready. The rains were here. By midday, the sky turned black, wind tearing through the trees like knives. The first sheets of rain hammered rooftops, rattled windows, and churned up the dry earth into thick mud. Within an hour, the streets of their new community were rivers, brown water licking at the tires of parked trucks and sedans lined up in driveways. Kathy was out there screaming at a crew of workers to keep hammering boards onto a roof despite the downpour, while Eva barked at a delivery driver who refused to unload supplies in the storm. Their arrogance didn't bend, not even when the thunder cracked so close it shook the very foundations of their stolen houses. I stood on the ridge overlooking it all, rain soaking through my shirt, dripping down my beard. My heart was steady, not racing, not faltering. I knew this wasn't my doing entirely. Nature had its role, but I had helped it along, loosening gates, directing the surge where it needed to go. I hadn't forced this flood. I had simply guided it, nudging inevitability in the right direction. By late afternoon, the water was roaring. Cars bobbed like toys, fences splintered and drifted away, and drywall peeled off houses that hadn't even been finished. The sight was almost biblical. Kathy was wading waist-deep, screaming orders at a neighbor, her red shirt plastered to her body as she pointed furiously toward the road where evacuees were fleeing in panic. Eva, her floral dress clinging and torn, had both arms flailing in despair, shrieking about insurance and calling for someone to bring sandbags that no one had. Their voices, once so smug, were shrill with terror now, carrying a different kind of music through the storm. The chaos built quickly. Transformers blew one by one, sparks lighting the storm clouds. Roofs ripped off like paper. Their precious subdivision, the rows of homes they had stolen from me, was disappearing in front of their eyes. Workers abandoned the site. Families ran, clutching children and pets, their screams blending with the howling wind. Still, Kathy and Eva refused to leave. They stood stubborn in the rushing water, furious at the universe, as if they could command nature to obey the same way they had bullied me. I descended into the floodplain slowly, water rising around my knees, my clothes heavy with the storm. They saw me then, the man they thought they defeated, and their rage sharpened into something primal. Kathy's finger jabbed toward me, her voice cracking with the force of her anger. Eva's arms shot into the air, flinging water as she shouted curses at me, blaming me for everything they were losing. They looked less like rulers and more like wild animals, cornered, panicked, desperate to claw at anything. I didn't flinch. I stood calm, my eyes locked on theirs, letting them scream, letting them believe for just one moment that their fury mattered. It didn't. The water kept rising, pulling at their legs, dragging chunks of wood and shingles between us. Behind them, an entire row of houses tilted as the ground beneath gave way, walls buckling before collapsing into the current. The noise was deafening, the crash echoing through the valley like a drumbeat of justice. Kathy shrieked something about calling the sheriff. Eva shouted about lawyers, lawsuits, and revenge. But her words drowned in the roar of the flood. There was no sheriff who could stop this, no lawyer who could write a contract against nature's will. They had stolen my land, defied warnings, laughed in my face. And now, the land had taken itself back. Lightning struck close, illuminating the chaos like a snapshot. For a frozen second, they looked like statues of rage and denial. Kathy pointing, Eva flailing, their faces twisted with hatred and fear. The water foamed at their waists, climbing higher with every passing minute. My heart didn't ache for them. It didn't need to. I thought of the months they tormented me, showing up at my door to wave forged permits in my face, parading buyers through half-finished homes, calling me a fool for clinging to a piece of dirt they claimed I didn't deserve. I remember the night they laughed outside my window, drinking wine and bragging about how they'd sell out the last of the lots before I could scrape together enough money for a lawyer. Their cruelty had been deliberate, sharpened like a blade, cutting into every part of my life. Now that blade turned back on them. As the sun dropped behind the storm clouds, the flood peaked. The subdivision was gone, buried under a churning brown sea of destruction. Trucks smashed against trees, rooftops floated aimlessly, and the once proud framework of new houses lay scattered like children's blocks. Kathy and Eva clung to a porch post that was barely hanging on, their faces pale, their hair plastered to their heads, their screams hoarse from hours of fighting what they couldn't win. I stood there until the very end, until the last house gave way and the water carried their dream out into the distance. The storm began to ease, rain softening into drizzle, thunder rolling further away. The flood didn't retreat quickly. It lingered, spreading its silence across the valley like a warning. When I finally turned and walked back toward my truck on the ridge, I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't need to. The land was mine again in its raw, scarred form. Kathy and Eva had nothing left. No houses, no buyers, no empire. Just mud, ruin, and the memory of their arrogance drowning with the flood. Justice wasn't always handed down in courtrooms or signed on legal papers. Sometimes it came roaring through in the form of water, unstoppable, unforgiving, final. And sometimes all a man had to do was step aside and let nature deliver the verdict.